With the new iPhone, you can watch, listen, ignore your friends, stalk your ex, download porno on a crowded bus, even check your email while getting hit by a train. All with the new iPhone.
For the better part of 2 decades, mankind has gained access to the entire wealth of human knowledge, conveniently laden at our fingertips in ways never before dreamed possible. Always connected, always nearby in our pockets, and now with AI technologies cropping up seemingly every day, it's as simple as asking a virtual assistant virtually any question that one could possibly possess in order to gain an answer, albeit one of dubious reliability. Likely why a 2024 Digital Education Council report found that 86% of college students incorporated AI into their coursework. And yet with all of this access to limitless data and new technologies, has that technology actually made us any smarter? The more information we have, the better we are able to think logically and make rational decisions based on that knowledge. With all of the world's data and information in the palms of our hands, surely having access to all that data must create a populace better able to understand how our world works, right? Well, no. That doesn't appear to be the case, and instead, actually, things may be reversed. Too much information can be a bad thing, overloading the brain's vast but still limited capacities, and creating a reliance on the technology that overloads it. While there are countless examples of how mere access to information does not lead to greater understanding or application of that information, I want to begin this video by illustrating the brain drain phenomenon of internet-initiated idiocy with a case study. Specifically, the case of Ethan Klein versus the left, a messy online political feud between formerly edgy content creator Ethan Klein and various left-wing political commentators and their fans who, in their quest to win this online spat, ostensibly about the conflict between Israel and Palestine, began spreading potentially very harmful misinformation about a parasite, Giardia. But why did they do this? Well, in an episode of his podcast, Ethan revealed that their newly adopted dog had tested positive for Giardia, and that he was concerned that his young children may have contracted it as well. They were all parasite-free, but it's a good thing that they got checked out, right? See, that's where you're wrong. In reaction to this seemingly utterly innocuous revelation, leftist streamer Bad Empanada informed his audience that Giardia is in fact extremely rare, and mockingly, at least I hope, described it as previously unknown to science, and something contracted exclusively via the ingestion of animal waste.
The only way that you can get Giardia is through some sort of contact with its poop only. This means that his dog, which he acknowledges here had Giardia, a parasite, I will emphasize, that was previously unknown to science until this escapade with Ethan Klein 2 weeks ago. The only possible way for this to be spread from his dog to himself and his family is through contact with contaminated.
Despite his conviction and authoritative tone, supposedly backed by extensive Googling and Wikipedia skimming, I'm sure, none of this is true. Giardia is very common in undeveloped nations, and it's still relatively common in the West, with 2 to 5% of the entire US population being infected each year, particularly young children. To be precise, there are about 19.5 thousand cases of Giardia in the US per year, and of those cases, over 30% are children under the age of 10. This is because young children, particularly those still crawling or teething, and as anyone who has even babysat a child can tell you, frequently put things in their mouths and touch objects that an infected animal could also have touched. Despite Empanada's claim, ingestion of animal waste is not the only way to contract the parasite, as swimming pools and bodies of fresh water are more common vectors of infection, hence its nickname, beaver fever. And speaking of beaver fever, another group at unique risk of contracting Giardia, I'm sure to Bad Empanada's dismay, is homosexuals.
And then they eat the poo-poo.
Giardia was also described as extremely serious, and while it certainly is something that need be treated, often with ivermectin, funnily enough, in the West there is virtually no mortality risk associated with Giardia, even in young children, being the most susceptible and the most vulnerable. All of this information is readily available online, and I mean, I'm a social science geek, not a medical doctor, and yet despite that ease of access, Little said about this disease, in this case, is factual. That wasn't the only blatantly incorrect information being passed around as accurate regarding the Kleins, as seemingly determined to one-up bad empanada at the Soviet Special Olympics. Fellow leftist streamer Denims concurred with his sentiments, or at least did not rebuke said sentiment, in her livestream viewers that Ethan Klein was guilty of child abuse.
He had to spend long hours hunched over a laptop, ignoring his children and the poop they were eating for months to deliver that powerful content puke against the most evil man to ever live, Hasan Piker.
Also, he literally makes fun of Mike from PA about weight all the time. That's not relevant to his arguments either.
Unsurprisingly, this all resulted in mass reports to Child Protective Services, who by law were required to investigate the Klein's home, which they allowed, asking their children questions and searching for evidence of poor conditions in their multi-million-dollar LA mansion. Denims later justified false reports, a crime pursuable both criminally and civilly in the state of California where this occurred, because, according to her, children do not form memories before the age of 5 or 6. Conveniently, the age of Ethan's oldest child.
Create any bad memory for them. You're not forming memories at 3 years old, and it's very rare that you're forming memories at 5 years old. Now, yes, you are. No, you're not. When we're talking about being able to remember, being able to recall memories, it's like 4 is the cutoff. But even if you are forming any memories at 4, you're not going to be able to remember them past like 15. You have maybe 1 or 2 memories.
Ignoring the implications carried by such a claim that children don't form memories, and as such it's alright to put them through a traumatic experience, it also just isn't true. Astonishingly, Denims reads directly from a Wikipedia article, which states that the mean age for first memories is 3.5.
There's a wide variation about the mean across methods, cohorts. The average age of adults' earliest memories is 3.5 years old.
Denims likely not knowing what mean means, as I doubt elementary mathematics is something within her repertoire, as such reaffirms her original statement then that children under 5 do not form memories.
You're not really forming memories at 3.
The mean is, of course, the average in a set of data, and as such, a mean of 3.5 would mean that half of children form memories before that age. She reads this information aloud, does not understand it, and instead thinks that she has affirmed her initial baseless claim, seemingly having overloaded her brain. Not that I think that's particularly difficult in her case. And as if it wasn't revolting enough that these people, in their arrogant internet brain-fueled ignorance, made false reports to CPS in a blatant attempt to destroy a family, in the weeks since the CPS call, the Kleins have claimed to have received human skulls sent to them in the mail.
There's something that I've never talked about publicly, but around the same time, we received 2 human skulls in the mail at our home, which led us to having a very pleasant interview with the FBI.
All while former YouTube golden boy Ian Joma, née Washburn, aka Idubbbz, released a video on the Kleins, his friends of nearly a decade, attacking their character without a single mention of the CPS incident. Initiated and encouraged all through sheer stupidity. Case study aside, here's the question I must ask. Does access to the entirety of human knowledge online, only ever seconds and a few stripes or keystrokes away, actually increase an individual's knowledge and understanding? The answer, it seems, is no. In fact, the opposite is more likely to be the case. The internet is making us dumber. While not every specimen of this phenomenon is equally as egregious as Denims or bad empanada, delegating our thinking to a phone or to a computer inherently means that we delegate less of it to our own minds, deferring to experts rather than thinking independently. Today, almost everyone, including children, has access to the internet and thereby access to near limitless information. But is TMI actually harmful for cognitive processing? Let's examine the now quite extensive research on how the internet, smartphones, and the addictions that these technologies can induce may stymie educational outcomes, cognitive development, memory formation and recall, problem solving and critical thinking, attention span and coordination, even producing changes in brain gray and white matter integrity and volume, and what the increasing delegation of mental tasks to artificial intelligence might mean for the future. Beginning with the basics to see just what happens when too much information essentially fries the human mind, by looking at the internet and information overload. When we are presented with functionally endless access to anything and everything, that sheer vastness of information can be overwhelming, creating confusion or doubt in those carefully considering all possible variables. And that doubt or confusion may ultimately lead to decreased accuracy, not increased. This is known as cognitive overload. The potential for cognitive overload was described by Giardia and Brighton 2009 as the less is more effect. Drawing from 20 studies from the same cohort, subjects were asked to either explain or predict why a given phenomenon exists. For example, which one of 2 Chicago high schools has a higher dropout rate, based on cues such as writing score and proportion of Hispanic students in the student body.
In Espanol, my nickname is El Tigre Chino! Because my knowledge will bite her face off.
Participants who relied on cognitive heuristics, snap judgments akin to intuition, were better able to predict which of the 2 schools had a higher dropout rate when they answered the question based on the raw tallying of numbers, without any statistical weights, and were the most accurate when they selected the answer that just sounded right and best to them, again relying on heuristics, not computation. That is, even when they had access to all of the math, they were less accurate at predicting school performance than when they just guessed, not based on facts, but based on feelings. While use of multiple regression analysis was most accurate in post facto hindsight analysis, in terms of predicting an outcome in the future, too much information can so overwhelm the senses that the most informed end up being the least accurate.
Source?
It was revealed to me in a dream.
If cognitive overload can reduce predictive accuracy, so too then may emotions overload one's capacity for cognition via similar overstimulation, as we can see in a study from Massidal 2011, who sought to identify if different forms of modern media exposure had positive or negative effects on cognitive performance in a sample of German college students who were tasked with playing either a high arousal, that is exciting, don't get too excited yourself, video game, Doom 3, playing a low arousal video game, in this case Professional Tennis 2006, or with watching a high arousal, again meaning exciting, film clip from Doom 2005, or a low arousal clip of a real tennis match. Before watching the clip or playing the game, subjects read a short informational news article about the construction of a new library on campus, which they were asked to pay close attention to over the course of 90 seconds, and were given another 90 seconds to memorize a list of 20 words in Turkish, none of which the participants spoke.
Follow in your book and repeat after me as we learn 3 new words in Turkish. Towel, bath, border.
After watching or playing, participants were given a multiple-choice test of their memory of the meaning of the Turkish words and a series of open-ended questions regarding information contained in the news passage about the new library. A measurement of general capacity for concentration, sensation-seeking, which is a desire to experience new and potentially even dangerous things, general intelligence, feelings of stress induced by the media exposure, and habitual media usage were assessed. They found that highly arousing media, one last time meaning exciting, regardless of its format, be it a video game or a film, reduced the ability of subjects to concentrate on subsequent tasks. Women possessed better memory after exposure to all forms of media than did men, but both sexes similarly experienced decreased ability to concentrate when exposed to more exciting media content. Not stress, nor media preference, nor sensation-seeking mediated this relationship, meaning that the relationship between consuming highly engaging media and decreased ability to concentrate is direct and linear. As such, while media use doesn't make one dumber inherently, it can affect our ability to concentrate. At least short-term, at least seen here. But those are movies and games, not the internet in general. So does having access to the entire catalog of human knowledge at our fingertips, just on the other side of a Google search, make a more informed and educated populace? Or one simply more reliant upon technology to answer questions for them? That question was assessed in a series of now somewhat famous studies from Sparrow, Liu, and Wegner 2011. In their first experiment, Harvard undergraduates were asked to keep a series of 6 digits in their minds and then answered a series of knowledge-based yes or no questions, followed by a modified Stroop task and another series of questions which were either easy or difficult. The Stroop effect describes a delay in cognitive processing when aspects of a stimuli are mismatched. For example, what color is this text? Right, it's blue. Now what color is this text? Of course, it's orange. If it took you a fraction of a second longer to correctly answer the second question, then you've just experienced the Stroop effect for yourself. In this modified version, participants were presented with words related to search engines and the internet, for example, Yahoo or Google, as well as unrelated words, for example, Target or Nike, and asked to press a key identifying the correct color of the word, either red or blue, expecting that they would pay more attention and thus be more accurate regarding words associated with search engines that would allow them to access information useful for the upcoming questions that they knew they were going to be asked, some of which were very specific, such as, quote, was Pepin king of the Franks from 482 to 511 AD, and is Krypton's atomic number 26? Participants who had been exposed to more difficult questions were particularly more accurate in correctly identifying the color of the text used for words which related to search engines or to technology. But all subjects were more accurate in identifying the technology terms compared to the non-tech terms.
What color is it? A, blue, B, red, C, green, or D, yellow? What color is what? Mexico.
Indicating that any anticipation of needing to answer factual questions primes thinking about search engines which could provide the answers. That is, people given difficult questions are particularly drawn to thinking about access to the internet. But even when the questions are simple, such as, are dinosaurs extinct? People are drawn to technology to perhaps reassure themselves that their responses are correct, rather than trusting their own knowledge. Or perhaps they're just looking for confirmation of their answer in anticipation of some kind of trick question. In their second experiment, a sample of undergraduates were exposed to a series of 40 trivia statements, a blank text box, and asked to type a copy of that statement into the text box.
I'm learning!
Some participants were informed that their statements would be saved for later when they pressed the spacebar, while others were told that pressing the spacebar erased their text to make room for the next statement. Further, some subjects were specifically instructed to try and remember the text, while others were given no such instruction. Afterwards, participants were asked to write down as many of the factoids that they could remember, and were then given the full list of statements to review, some of which had been slightly altered, and asked to confirm if the information provided was the same as what they had read during the initial task. Those who believed that the computer had saved what they had typed to be available later in the experiment recalled more factoids than did those who believed they had erased their text, regardless of whether or not they had been instructed to remember the statements. In contrast, when specifically asked to remember the information, those who believed that their text had been erased performed the best out of the 4 groups in recognizing whether or not the post-test factoids were identical to those presented during the experiment, while those who were told to memorize the statements but then believed that their answers would be saved for later performed the worst at recalling factoids after the test. It seems then that the participants in this study performed significantly differently on tests of short-term memory depending on whether or not they believed that they would have access to technology that could provide the answers to them in the future, but that the valence, the factor of tech plays here, is dichotomous. Believing that the answers would be available later increased performance on restating the information, while at the same time decreasing performance in recalling specific information. It is possible, then, that reliance on technology promotes repetition and regurgitation, not comprehension of information. Sparrow et al.'s third experiment elaborated upon the findings from their first two. Undergraduate students at Columbia were asked to type 30 statements shown on their computer screens into a text box. After typing out each statement, subjects received a message.
I doubt anyone here would recognize civic virtue if it reached up and bit you in the ass.
A message that it either had been saved to a specific folder labeled facts, data, info, etc., or that it had been erased. Afterwards, participants were given a list of all of the factoids that they had typed, some of which, again, had been slightly altered, and were asked to identify if the statement was exactly the same as the one they had originally typed. Those who believed that one of their answers had been deleted were better able to correctly recall the exact information that they had typed regarding those exact same questions. In contrast, when asked if the factoids presented at the end of the study had been saved to the computer, saved to a specific folder, or deleted, those who believed the text had been saved more accurately recalled being informed that it had been saved, compared to those who were told that the text had been deleted. That is, when people believed they would have access to the information in the future, it was the knowledge of access to the information that was acquitted to memory, not the information itself. However, when asked, quote, if the information was saved, what folder was it saved into, end quote, those who believed their text had been deleted most accurately recalled that it had been deleted. This is perhaps because the nature of asking a very specific question, such as what folder was the text saved into, prompted deeper processing and therefore incongruence. In this case, the file either being saved to a precise location, all becoming more salient. What does any of this mean in practice? Well, have you ever saved a meme, forgotten about it, and then only weeks or months or years later are reminded of that meme? You know you saved it, but you don't necessarily know where. But you can remember that you saved it and remember that you did not delete it. Yet this only concerns recognition that one knows information exists somewhere, not what the actual content of that information contains.
My dick hurt. When did I tweet this?
With the seeming importance of not just access, but location of that access in mind, a fourth experiment sought to identify if access to information is more important than actual knowledge. Columbia students were again tasked with typing facts into a text box, but this time, upon pressing the spacebar, they were told the file had been saved to a specific folder with a generic name. Again, either facts, data, info, names, items, or points. After completing the task, subjects were shown a list of the factoids, some of which, again, were altered, and asked to identify the statements identical to the ones they had typed and to which folder the items were saved. To the surprise of the authors, participants were better able to recall where the information had been saved to than they were able to recall the information itself. It seems then that memorizing one has access to information and where to obtain that information is more important than memorizing said information itself. If everything I could ever need to know is in the palm of my hand, why would I remember the what and not just the where? Sparrow, Liu, and Wagner coined this exact phenomenon the Google effect.
The Google debunkers don't want you to know about this. The Google debunkers are trying to cover it up. The government is full of Google debunkers.
But the tendency to care more about remembering where to find information over the information itself has also been described as cognitive offloading. Voynia et al. 2020, in a review of the literature on using the internet as a form of cognitive enhancement, note two additional effects of access to all this information beyond overloading and offloading, that being susceptibility to misinformation.
You really think someone would do that? Just go on the internet and tell lies?
As a manifestation of the leveling effect proposed initially by Metzger and Flanagan in 2013. The leveling effect is the tendency to categorize all information with similar ease of accessibility as similar in quality and inaccuracy. What is then prioritized in determining the truth is the availability of information on a subject, not the veracity of any relevant facts and potential misinformation. Due to it usually being novel or interesting, clickbait tends to be frequently more easily available than real facts online, as seen in a massive analysis of viral tweets that were retweeted by about 3 million people made between 2006 and 2017, and had been fact-checked by 6 relevant groups. Snopes, PolitiFact, FactCheck, Truth or Fiction, Hoaxslayer, and Urban Legends. A rogues gallery even Batman wouldn't want to deal with.
You sit on a throne of lies.
But that agreed across these groups that the information was false, identifying about 126,000 rumor cascades in the network from Musugi, Roy, and Aral, 2018. The most commonly propagated rumor cascades were political, with around 45,000 tweets and retweets concerning political topics. It took 6 times as long for a factual statement to be seen by at least 1,500 people on Twitter compared to a falsehood, and took 20 times longer for a factual statement to be spread more than 10 degrees of separation away from the original poster than was a falsehood. Political information was the most pervasive, traveling deeper and more broadly, reaching more people and going more viral than any other type of false information, reaching more than 20,000 people nearly 3 times faster than it took for all other types of misinformation to reach just 10,000 people. While other types of fake news traveled more broadly at weaker depths of diffusion from the source, political misinformation reached more broadly at deeper depths. Further, it was not major accounts that tended to spread false information, but instead accounts with relatively few followers, who followed fewer people, and were generally less active that tended to be the source of rumors. When accounting for profile age, activity, number of follows, and verification status, false information was 70% more likely to be reposted compared to facts. But why is false information so much more likely to be shared than the truth? Is it just because fiction is so much more interesting than reality? And when all information is equally accessible, the more interesting stories are the ones that are getting shared and then subsequently remembered? To answer that exact question, the authors surveyed 5,000 users who had propagated either true or false rumors, true rumors being statements of fact that lacked supporting evidence, and collected 25,000 tweets that those users had been exposed to in the 60 days leading up to spreading rumors themselves. They found that false rumors resulted in replies expressing more surprise or shock, but also feelings of disgust, whereas true rumors inspired more sadness, anticipation, joy, and trust. As such, it does seem that being shocking or disgusting is what makes false rumors unique, and likely partially explains why they spread so much more easily and thoroughly within a communication network. As a result, and as Voyna et al. Describe in their own review, because misinformation is more novel and more interesting, that also means that for social media sites, the financial goals of which are of course to keep your eyes on the page, drowning in infinite doom scrolling, that accurate fact-checking and removal of false information is not in any of those companies' best interests. Hence perhaps why, despite political backlash from the fact-checkers, Mark Zuckerberg, in the wake of the approval many had expressed for X's community notes system, announced a plan to fire the entire Meta fact-checking team because unsubstantiated rumors are just more engaging and interesting than boring, old facts. People who are overwhelmed by too much information are less able to make accurate predictions about reality. And as the source of that information has almost entirely moved to the digital, where rumors, be they truthful or not, receive the same, if not far more attention than pure statements of fact, as such, despite having better access to information than ever, the accuracy of that information is diluted by the sheer volume of it that is available. And this all seems particularly prevalent on social media sites such as Twitter, which distract our attention away from truths for juicier, more interesting fictions. Since the advent of the smartphone, not only do we have access to seemingly limitless information, we have access to it at all times, serving as a digital distraction constantly within reach so that the flow of that information is incessant, while also providing a cognitive backup such that non-novel information need not be committed to memory due to a perception that it will always be available. Another aspect that may deleteriously affect learning and memorization of information gathered online is that the overload is not just in the raw quantity or varying quality of information, but also that it is inescapable, and as such, perpetually divides our attention span between endless sources, as we can see in data from Yekelis, Cummings, and Reeves, 2014, who examined how frequently users switched between tasks on their computers using screen capturing software They took shots of participants' desktops every 5 seconds over a period of 28 hours in a small sample of undergraduate students. Participants were also given a wrist accelerometer to wear, which measures skin conductance responses, the electrodermal activity of the skin, and which can be activated by emotional arousal. They found that the average length of time spent on a single screen or application was 65 seconds. However, the median time spent per page was 19 seconds, and the most commonly repeating length of time spent on a single page, was only 5 seconds, and comprised 25% of the sample. Pages that were viewed for more than 4 minutes comprised 8% of the sample, and mostly consisted of video streaming services. Further, the researchers found that arousal increased for about 12 seconds before a switch to another screen or application, peaking at the time of the switch and then decreasing slowly. However, this was only the case when switching from work to entertainment, and not vice versa. The key takeaway here, however, is that people tend to spend an extremely short amount of time dedicated to any one process while using technology, rarely more than a few minutes, with the exception of watching videos, and are actually even emotionally aroused by the anticipation of switching to a new or different task. Despite the rapid nature with which people tend to shuffle between stimuli and the infinite vastness of information that is the internet, forcing us to multitask, is there any evidence that this constant exposure and perpetual access helps or hurts our cognitive capacities? One of the most seminal studies on the subject of digital multitasking and cognitive control from Ophir, Nass, and Wagner, 2009, examined differences in performance on goal maintenance and memory tasks between self-reported high and low media multitaskers. High media multitaskers, HMMs, were less proficient at filtering out irrelevant information, evidenced by diminished performance compared to low media multitaskers, LMMs, in correctly identifying whether or not a red shape situated amongst a series of blue shapes, intended to distract from the red shape, had changed in its orientation between two images. In another task of the potential influence of distractors, subjects were asked to select a pair of items that they were instructed to look for out of a set of paired items. For example, A is paired with X, not B with X, nor A with Y. And while both high and low media multitaskers were equally proficient at this base task, when a distractor item was included, which participants were instructed to ignore, and was highlighted in a different color as the other items, high media multitaskers were slower to answer, albeit by a fraction of a second on average. Accuracy at identifying the correct pair was the same across both groups. However, the decrease in response speed was statistically significant. Results of a 2 and 3 back task similarly showed decreased working memory performance from high media multitaskers compared to low ones. N-back tasks provide subjects with a series of items, typically letters, and at random intervals, ask them to recall the content of the second or third item back in that series. While performance decreased in accuracy of items 3 spaces back compared to 2 spaces back for both of the groups, high media multitaskers' performance diminished significantly more compared to low multitaskers, producing more false positives. Unsurprisingly, people who distract themselves with a deluge of apps and screens are more prone to distraction, and that distraction negatively affects memory, likely outsourcing that function to the smartphone.
Why am I paying you to tell me things I've already figured out on my own?
Maybe because I graduated first in my class at Stanford in 1972.
You graduated 12th in your class in 1968.
She Googled your ass.
One might expect that even if frequent media multitasking seems to be harmful for cognitive ability, that at least multitaskers would be better at switching between tasks, but that too was not what Ophir et al. Found, as in a test of task switching, subjects were shown a combination of a number and a letter, and asked to identify if the numeral was an even or an odd, or if the letter was a consonant or a vowel, with questions about either the letter or the number presented in random order, such that some questions about the number were followed by another such question, remaining stable, while other questions about the number were followed by a question about the letter, switching tasks. High media multitaskers were significantly slower at answering both questions, but were particularly impeded when the tasks were switched. Because high media multitaskers performed similar to low media multitaskers when there were no distractors, the authors then hypothesized that this result, as in the other tasks, is the product of HMM users being more easily distracted by almost anything, and as a result of being so easily distracted, make more errors, take longer to think, and generally just have a poorer memory. But Ofer et al.'s work was conducted all the way back in the late 2000s, not long after the launch of the original iPhone. So what more have we learned about digital multitasking and cognition in the years since smartphones infiltrated the zeitgeist?
But at least now it can't get much worse.
But it did get worse.
Let's look at a review of literature on the subject from Unkamfer and Wagner 2018 for some answers. Regarding cognitive profiles, compared to low-media multitaskers, HMMs tend to struggle staying on task due to difficulties in maintaining attention. 24 of the tests reviewed here concerned memory. Experiments that measured simple working memory, which frequently is assessed in detection of the differences between present and past stimuli, consistently found that low and high media multitaskers tend to perform similarly when there are no distractions present, but high media multitaskers performed worse in about half of all tests that included distractors from the task at hand. More complex tests of working memory do not just require the participant identify changes, but intentionally update the information given to participants to test if they are able to integrate that new knowledge into their cognitive schema. The research reviewed by Unkamfer and Wagner produced either null or negative effects on complex working memory for high-media multitaskers compared to low ones. No study, as of the publication of that analysis, found that being a heavy-media multitasker had any positive effect on either form of working memory. Although it does seem that high-media multitaskers are more easily distracted, Unkamfer and Wagner's review did not find that result to be consistent with one's capacity to filter out irrelevant information, as one study found that a distracting noise that occurred at the same time as a change in visual stimuli actually increased accuracy in detection of differences in said stimuli, specifically in high-media multitaskers. Thus, while distractors may harm working memory for heavy users, when the distractions are associated with the main task, those same high-media multitaskers paying attention to multiple sources more so than low-media multitaskers may possess greater memory in that specific task. These authors suggest that this may be because the tasks in many of these tests are too simple and tend to just bore those that are used to so much constant stimulation, causing them to thereby be more easily distracted, because they're bored. Either way though, HMMs are more susceptible to interference, particularly as time goes on and the limited attention that they can allocate to these boring tasks becomes stressed thinner and thinner, which perhaps explains their tendency to make more false reports when identifying memory discrepancies or lack thereof. But much as how a distracting noise aided in HMM's ability to access their working memory, so too were they more prone to find differences between stimuli when the difference was more vibrant and it popped out at them compared to low-media multitaskers. And that makes sense, as high-media multitaskers tend to seek out new and novel sensations to avoid boredom.
Bored, 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 bored.
Relatedly, high-media multitaskers tend to have more variability in their response time reactions to stimuli than do low-media multitaskers, indicating that while HMMs are capable of paying attention, that attention is inconsistent and, as such, generally are less able to focus on a given topic or task compared to those low in media multitasking proclivity. While two studies found that HMMs were actually faster at switching between tasks, and while another found that LMMs were faster, the rest of the literature reviewed here found no significant difference between groups, meaning that it's potentially individual differences in people and in tasks that determines if high-media multitaskers are better or worse at switching between them, at least compared to low MMs, again indicating that the issue arises from preference for multitasking rather than the mere ability to multitask. That preference for multitasking seems to be, at times, difficult to control, given the expediency at which people can flip between tabs, apps, and media, being potentially impulsive more so than cognitive. Although the results have not been identical across the board, the skew of the available data indicate that HMMs tend to be impulsive or at least have a decreased ability to control their behaviors compared to LMMs, hence why distractors are potentially so inhibitory to their performances on cognitive tasks. 3 experiments that assessed nonverbal relational reasoning found that HMMs were less able to fill in missing pieces of a pattern, perhaps due to their attention being so diffused that they miss the minutiae, even if they get the big picture of the puzzle. In 2 tests of long-term memory, HMMs also performed worse than did LMMs, being less able to correctly identify an object on a subsequent test as being the same as the one they had been previously exposed to. They were also marginally worse at ignoring distracting objects, continuing to recall them in later assessments. In contrast, over time, LMMs became faster at identifying objects they had previously seen. In total then, with the exception of task switching, for which the data are all over the place, people who persistently are high in media multitasking have poorer memories, both long and short term, are less able to complete patterns, and are generally just more distracted and have more limited attention spans. Finally, it seems that high versus low media multitasking manifests differently in neurological functioning, as Low and Kanai 2014 found that higher media multitasking propensity was associated with less gray matter volume in the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC, as assessed via magnetic imaging scanning. The ACC is an area of the brain associated with emotional regulation, reward, decision-making, and perhaps most importantly, impulse control. Gray matter is a type of tissue that plays an essential role in cognitive functions, including memory, and tends to shrink as we age. Further, high MMs were found to have weaker connectivity between the ACC and the precuneus, another region of the brain that is associated with memory. An additional study in this review found that when distractions were present, HMMs experienced greater activation in various areas of the brain compared to LMMs, specifically the lateral superior and middle frontal gyri, as well as the medial portion of the superior frontal gyrus. The lateral superior frontal gyrus is associated with language, the middle frontal gyrus with both literacy and numeracy, and the medial superior frontal gyrus has been associated with working memory. While these data are not causal, they do illustrate that there is a correlation between high media multitasking and increased activation in regions largely unrelated to memory, while causing a disconnect between 2 memory-centric regions and being related to decreased gray matter in a key region affiliated with multiple aspects of cognition, the ACC. That is, when high media multitaskers are exposed to distractions, their brains respond to that stimuli in ways that do not facilitate memorization. We can see here then that for whatever reason, persistent media multitasking not only lights up mostly unrelated regions of the brain when faced with distractors, but that it also prevents connectivity between processing and memorization, and ultimately, at least correlationally, is indicative of decreased gray matter volume in an area of the brain responsible for inhibition, for being able to say no, it's time to stop doom scrolling. Being terminally online, therefore, may actually damage the part of your brain that allows you to control impulsive behavior, resulting perhaps in an inescapable cycle of literal brain rot. Be honest, how many times have you switched tasks while listening to this video? It's okay, we're all a little bit terminally online. And of course, the irony is that you probably wouldn't even be watching this video in the first place if you weren't, and I wasn't. Funny that. Understanding that the internet is full of distractors, and that there are some people uniquely prone to distraction, which seems to result in diminished attention spans, cognitive ability, and memory, let's turn our attention, while we still have some left, more specifically to social media and its effect on mental ability, which we can see in an analysis from Alloway et al. 2013, who examined the relationship between the use of technology and various social and cognitive variables in a sample of 15 to 17-year-old UK secondary school students. The variables assessed were verbal ability, which is one's capacity to define words spoken aloud, working memory, measured by repeating back a series of numbers spoken in sequence, learning outcomes, evaluated using the Wechsler Individual Assessment Test for both spelling and arithmetic skills, social connectedness, which is a sense of belonging within one's family, friends, peers, or society, and a length of average use of social media sites, specifically Facebook and YouTube, as well as what participants used these sites for and how they tended to engage with content on said sites. Actively, for example, leaving comments, which I would greatly appreciate, or passively, for example, reading a friend's status update. Heavier users of Facebook scored higher on average on tests of working memory, verbal ability, and spelling, but were not more prolific in maths than were light users. Only one activity, checking friend status updates, was related to cognitive ability, but specifically only to verbal ability. There was no difference between heavy users and light users of YouTube and any of the measures of cognitive ability, nor was any specific activity on YouTube related to those measures. On both social media platforms, active versus passive usage was similarly unrelated to cognitive ability. There was also no relationship between feeling socially connected to others and activity on either website. In total then, heavier users of Facebook, but not YouTube, tend to possess better working memory and are more able to understand the meaning of words and make fewer spelling errors than do lighter users of the platform, although they are not more competent at arithmetic than are their lighter user peers. These data are, of course, however, correlational, and as such, it's impossible to say if those who spend more time using social media are already higher in verbal IQ, or if something about social media, reading more posts from others rather than watching videos, improves some forms of verbal intelligence. Hence why Facebook Scrabble is a war zone.
Oh my god. Ginger? Oh.
It may be because most social media websites and most content on the internet in general is still largely text-based, or at least relies more on verbal proficiency over mathematical proficiency or specific knowledge, that heavier users are competent at spelling and understanding words, while lighter users, say the types of people who used Yahoo Answers, are less, let's say, verbally gifted.
Am I pregnant? Am I pregnant? Am I pargant? Am I gregnant?
Interestingly, those heavy users also tended to have better working memory, which, as we've previously seen, is the opposite of what we typically find in high media multitaskers. It's possible that because the content of social media tends to be, well, social, and not so much intellectual, that the content itself influenced working memory. In that if the thing stimulating the brain is more social, be it gossip or politics or just getting a glimpse into the lives of others, then working memory may not be as impaired by heavy media usage. But that's just speculation on my part. So as to not further speculate, let's examine how the content itself and the distracting nature of the internet, with endless access to anything and everything that anyone could ever want all of the time, influences our thinking by looking into the phenomenon of internet cognitive failure. With access to everything and anything online, potentially to the deficit of our own memories and attention spans, does the content itself play a role regarding the problems potentially posed by prolonged internet exposure? What factors influence the internet cognitive failure phenomenon, and what even is internet cognitive failure? A cognitive failure describes difficulty in performing some task that under normal circumstances would be easily completed, and has been often attributed to the presence of distractions.
What would you think about something like that? Pill that could make you 7 times smarter.
Cheese, huh? All right.
Given that the internet is full of distractions, as we've seen, Ali and Nisa 2013 conducted an exploratory survey to understand if excessive internet use was related to more cognitive failure experiences, which was measured with questions such as, quote, "Do you start doing one thing at home and get distracted into doing something else unintentionally?" End quote, in a sample of Pakistani university students who reported using the internet for at least an hour a day over the past 6 months, most time of which I would imagine was spent scamming pensioners, just statistically speaking.
Do not read it! What? Do not read the cards!
They found a curvilinear relationship between cognitive failure and internet addiction or dependency. While non-addicted users experienced similar levels of cognitive failures as did those mildly dependent, moderately dependent users experienced significantly more cognitive failures than those with mild or no addiction. However, mild dependency was also considerably more strongly correlated with cognitive failure than was severe dependency. That is then, people with low or severe levels of internet addiction are less likely to experience cognitive failures, mistakes caused by distractions, than are those with moderate levels of internet addiction, which specifically describes internet use that is disruptive to relationships, job performance, and life in general. It may be that at low levels of internet addiction, people recognize that the obsessive behavior is harmful on some level and attempt to manage it, but like all addictions, at some point for many, it can no longer be so easily managed and begins to have prominent effects on one's life. For those with moderate levels of internet addiction, those effects, as a function of cognitive failure, include struggling with completing even simple tasks, from being able to remember people's names, appointments, or what one needs from the store, to struggling with staying on one task while completing another, such as cleaning one's room or answering emails, to a propensity for daydreaming and procrastination, to even more concerning behaviors, such as frequently bumping into, dropping, or losing things, and getting easily lost oneself, to getting angry and saying things one normally would not thinking about the consequences at the time, to just having difficulty coming up with anything to say in general when pressed. For those severely addicted to the internet, the authors hypothesize that those individuals likely have abandoned much of their real-world obligations in favor of focusing exclusively on the digital, and as a result, suffer fewer cognitive failures. They essentially have adapted. As such, it seems that a moderate amount of problematic internet use causes difficulties in everyday life, making even some of the simplest activities a struggle for those moderately addicted. But Ali and Nisa's early identification of internet cognitive failure was published in early 2013, at which point between 45 and 56% of US adults owned a smartphone. By May of 2023, that percentage had increased to 90% across the entire population and 97% for Americans between the ages of 18 and 49, according to Statista data. Almost everyone carries the internet around with them in their purses or pockets. So we need to ask, does mobile phone use similarly result in cognitive failures? Or is that more limited to stationary devices, such as laptops or desktops, which are comparatively less likely to be used while out and about and in real-world situations? For some answers, we can look to Kancharla, Kanagaraj and Gopal 2022, who examined smartphone addiction and cognitive failures in a sample of Indian university students. Cognitive failures here contained 3 dimensions: forgetfulness, distractibility, and false triggers, which describes disruptions in cognitive or motor behavior and was measured with questions such as, quote, "Do you find you forget which way to turn on a road you know well but rarely use?" End quote. Heavy smartphone users scored higher on all 3 of the cognitive failure components compared to normal users, and the most frequently reported cognitive failure was distractibility, followed by false triggering and then forgetfulness. As smartphone use increased, so too did cognitive failure. False triggering was positively related to forgetfulness, indicating that when people experience a false trigger, such as frequently dropping things or failing to notice signposts, they also struggle with forgetfulness more generally. In contrast, false triggering was negatively related to distractibility, meaning that when a false trigger occurs, people tend to focus on that trigger and become less distracted. The fact that excessive internet use produces increased false triggering at all, which in turn could lead to serious consequences such as accident and injury alone, should be of serious social concern. Hadlington 2015 surveyed British participants aged 18 to 65 on how much time they spent online generally and specifically using a mobile phone per week, experience with cognitive failure in day-to-day life, including issues with memory, distractibility, lapses in concentration or motor control, and problems recalling names.
Okay, you can get this one. I know it's just like beard face, but not beard face. What is it? Oh, right. Beard mouth.
Participants also reported on their experiences with problematic phone usage and internet addiction, which was measured using the Internet Cognitive Scale and includes feeling depressed or lonely while online, having diminished impulse control, using the internet as a form of social comfort, and using it as a distraction or as an avoidance mechanism. They found that both measures of internet addiction and problematic smartphone use were related to cognitive failures in daily life, and that men tended to experience more cognitive failures than did women. Participants who reported low levels of online cognitions, again a symptom of unhealthy internet use, also reported fewer cognitive failures compared to those with high levels of online cognitions. Similarly, those with low levels of problematic smartphone use experienced fewer cognitive failures than did those with high levels of use. The negative effects on cognitive functioning produced by general internet addiction were nearly identical to those produced by problematic smartphone use. As such, any cognitive impairments that result from excessive, obsessive use of a laptop or desktop are more or less the same in their potency as those that result from constantly doom scrolling on your phone. It is not the form of access then, it's the internet itself. As such, we could reasonably predict that whatever stymieing effects problematic internet use has on one device will translate to most, if not all of them. One key variable that may, however, influence internet cognitive failures is age. As we've already discussed, 97% of American adults under 50 and 89% of those aged 50 to 65 own a smartphone. But those generational groups were obviously introduced to this technology at different stages of their lives. For example, in the first year of the Zoomer generation, 1996, only 23% of US adults were online. But by the last year of the Zoomer, 2012, that had reached 83% of the adult US population, with 45% owning a smartphone by that year. In 2012, the youngest members of Gen X were 37, and the mean age of millennials was 20, while the youngest Zoomer was just 4 years old, and the oldest 15. Although, of course, adults are the ones buying mobile devices for their kids, none of Gen Z was included in the Pew dataset of that time frame, being under 18. But a 2020 report from Common Sense Media found that in 2011, 38% of children aged 0 through 8 had previously used a mobile device, such as a smartphone or tablet. And by 2013, with the ushering in of Gen Alpha, 72% of children 8 and under had used such a device. Well, I can remember using the internet when I was about 8 or younger myself. That was mostly getting emails from friends and family with a funny dancing baby that only took a half an hour to download. We are not the same. But Gen Alpha are the first generation to really grow up with the internet as a constant. The post-iPad generation. Poor sons of bitches. But do generational differences in exposure to technology affect internet cognitive failure and smartphone use? A study from Masia et al. 2022 surveyed adults aged 18 to 57 to examine generational differences in cognitive failures. Participants answered questions regarding their problematic mobile phone use, which included items such as, quote, "I lose sleep due to the time I spend on my mobile phone." Smartphone distraction, which includes items such as, quote, "I often talk to others while checking what's on my phone." Cognitive failures, and their propensity for phubbing. Phubbing is the seemingly socially paradoxical phenomenon that describes an instance wherein people, intentionally or not, ignore face-to-face social interaction in order to check their smartphone, disconnecting from a real social interaction to connect to a virtual one. Across all of their variables, Gen X scored lower compared to Gen Y, millennials, meaning that Gen X are less likely to struggle with problematic smartphone use, less likely to be distracted by their phones, less likely to prioritize their phones over other people, and suffer less from internet cognitive failures than do millennials. A similar trend was the case for Gen X compared to Gen Z, but while millennials' scores on all of these measures were significantly higher than Gen X, two items were not statistically significantly different between Gen X and Gen Z. Interpersonal conflict caused by excessive phone use, and nomophobia, which is a fear of not having access to one's mobile device in a social setting. By the way, does the word have to be so similar sounding to nomophonia? Suppose it's just serendipity. Anyway, Gen Z experienced some forms of phubbing more so than did Gen X, specifically social isolation, which is a preference for online over face-to-face communication, and in recognizing that their use was problematic. In turn, millennials experienced more nomophobia and interpersonal conflict phubbing than did Zoomers, but the difference was non-significant, as was the difference between the two groups regarding social isolation. However, millennials were less able to recognize that their use was potentially harmful than were Zoomers. Millennials scored higher than Zoomers on one aspect of smartphone distraction, attention impulsiveness, constantly thinking about checking their phones, and similarly had higher scores of problematic smartphone withdrawal, being unwilling to shut off their device, at least compared to Zoomers. Finally, Gen Y reported more cognitive failures of distractibility and physical blunders compared to Gen Z. It seems then that millennials are the generation struggling with internet or smartphone addiction and its consequences the most. There was not a single statistically significant variable in which Zoomers outranked millennials in disordered online habits. Despite using the internet for slightly fewer minutes a day than did Gen Z, according to Statista data, Gen Ys are seemingly more addicted to the internet. While Zoomers also had far higher scores on most of these measures than did Gen X, just as do Gen Ys, both Gen X and Gen Z at least seem to be less prone to nomophobia and using the internet as a form of social isolation than is Gen Y. I know a trip to TikTok may make it appear that Zoomers are the generation most terminally online, but it's actually millennials who struggle the most with touching grass, as I can personally attest. Despite some generational differences, the cognitive failures associated with internet addiction and problematic smartphone use is consistent across age groups. Whether they're using a desktop or a smartphone, the internet is a vast place where every single thing that brain of yours can think of can be found. So are certain types of websites, namely social media outlets, different from general or mobile internet access in its effects on cognitive function? When considering the potential for internet cognitive failure that distraction provides, probably no other genre of website is as infamous for being distracting and as time-sinking than is social media. Xu and Lin 2017 examined how various functional aspects of social media and the needs of its users influence cognitive absorption in a sample of Taiwanese Facebook users. Cognitive absorption describes a state of deep involvement with technology, which includes trouble keeping track of time, focused immersion in the experience, increased enjoyment, a sense of control, and curiosity. They hypothesized that when the needs of the users, maintaining social relationships, reputation building, acquiring and sharing information, and contact with business owners, among other things, fits with the technical capacities of the platform. For example, capacity to access content, capacity to interact with others, capacity to form relationships with others, and capacity to express oneself, then in that case, users would experience greater cognitive absorption and as a result, would be more likely to continue to use the site in the future. While both user needs and functional capacity were directly related positively to cognitive absorption, which itself was related to continued use of the service, this relationship was stronger when the website's capabilities met users' needs. People tend to get the most immersed in social media when the platform is constantly keeping them distracted, becoming perhaps even addicted to the endless stream of content that the platform provides. The designers of these outlets are well aware of this and program their websites accordingly to keep your eyes on the prize, their ad revenue, your time, and attention. It seems then that as said stream of information absorbs more and more of our attention and time, eventually it can turn into a torrent.
You are a pirate!
No, not like that. Instead, one that produces cognitive failure after cognitive failure as a result of media overload, which we can learn more about in a paper from Weldon, Islam, and Brooks 2017. They defined media overload as being a combination of two factors: information overload and communication overload. Information overload occurs when one's ability to process information is outmatched by the load of information itself, be it in amount or in complexity, while communication overload occurs when one's ability to communicate with others becomes stretched too thin to meet communication demands. Both communication and information overload have been previously found to be related to poor decision-making, stress, low morale, mental health problems, and decreased technology-based performance. They hypothesized then that there were three contributing factors to information and communication overload, and thus ultimately media overload. Those being fear of missing out, or FOMO, which is, quote, a pervasive apprehension that others might be having rewarding experiences from which one is absent, deficient self-regulation, essentially a lack of impulse control, and cognitive failure. Irish and American university students, that is, students at an Irish university and at an American one, I'm not suggesting that in the US there's some sort of segregation of the Irish from the rest of the populace,
Let's get the jolly old fiddle out and stick it through someone's head.
were recruited to compete in a survey regarding their experiences with information overload, communication overload, fear of missing out, deficient self-regulation, and internet cognitive failure. They found that deficient self-regulation, again, poor impulse control, was positively related to both information and communication overload. FOMO was related positively as well to communication overload and to internet cognitive failure. As such, those experiencing media overload by spending an excess amount of time online and being exposed to countless instances of information and communication overloads are likely to also experience problems with impulse control, fear missing out, and be more prone towards cognitive failure. Of course, these are just correlations, so the opposite may be the case, in that those already prone to impulsivity, fear of missing out, and are easily affected by distractions are more likely to experience media overload, but there certainly is a relationship there. On the subject of fear of missing out, it is a key component of what makes social media so addictive, and thus of potential importance for understanding that addiction. As a social species, we have a need to be in the loop regarding social norms, communication, and relationships, such as to not feel ostracized.
It says no homers. We're allowed to have one.
Under harsh evolutionary conditions, not being integrated into the community and its culture could mean the difference between life and death. So while the fear of missing out phenomenon has largely been used to describe social media, it is derived from very old, very real mortal fears. A study from Montag and Market 2023 surveyed Germans on their fear of missing out, both as a temporary state and as a personality trait. Social network use disorder, or SNUD, perhaps correctly pronounced SNEED, aka social media addiction, their experience with cognitive failures, and their social media usage. As we would expect at this point, participants who used social media reported higher levels of both trait, personality-dependent, and state, context-dependent fear of missing out, tended to be more addicted to social media, and had more cognitive failures than did those who did not use social networking sites, or who specifically were not addicted to social media. That last part might sound obvious, but despite saying that they didn't use social media, some subjects still presented with indicators of social media addiction, and those that did were also higher in FOMO and cognitive failure than non-users with few symptoms of SNUD.
The shop is called Sneed's Feed and Seed, where feed and seed both end in the sound eed.
Regardless of social media addiction and use, women tended to report more cognitive failure across the board, while male non-users experienced more state-based FOMO than did women. Both state and trait FOMO were related to SNUD, which in turn was weakly but significantly related to cognitive failure. Only trait-based FOMO, that is people who fear missing out habitually, not only in specific circumstances, tend to be more prone to experience cognitive failure. As such, people who are always concerned with missing out on something are likely distracted by that anxiety that something interesting might be happening somewhere without their knowledge, and as a result, tend to have more cognitive failures, as do those who report higher levels of disordered social media use, which itself is related to both types of fear of missing out. Those who need to be in the know all the time, unsurprisingly then, tend to be more addicted to the internet and subsequently, either directly or indirectly, are more distracted and thus more forgetful, less able to process information, and are more prone to making errors. To get a more bird's-eye view of how disordered internet use relates to cognitive impairments, we can look to a meta-analysis of 40 studies from Weaponized et al. 2019 that all assessed problematic internet use, PIU, and cognitive function. The types of cognitive function included in these studies were attentional inhibition, measured here with expedience of response to incongruous stimuli. For example, asking what color this word is. Motor inhibition, which is the ability to adapt and inhibit behaviors when necessary. For example, stopping at a stop sign.
Why's your blinker on? Never let them know your next move.
Prepotent motor inhibition, which is the ability to overcome a pre-planned behavior when not appropriate. For example, stopping at a streetlight as it turns red, rather than blasting through an intersection. Decision-making, working memory, and discounting, which is a measure of impulse control, assessing if participants prefer a similar, more immediate reward rather than a delayed, larger one. Weaponized et al. Found that problematic internet use was related to difficulties with both motor and prepotent motor function, as well as impairments in attentional inhibition, decision-making, and working memory, but not to discounting. Age, sex, psychological comorbidities, region, and gaming as a main source of one's online communication were all unrelated to the relationship between PIU and these various cognitive difficulties. Across the board, then, people who are more addicted to the internet, however they access it, are more likely to suffer from cognitive failures as a result of that addiction, struggling with everything from paying attention to making decisions to forming memories, and even to controlling physical impulses as a result. If addiction to the internet, regardless of the manner through which it is accessed, be it PC or laptop or tablet or smartphone, can cause serious cognitive impairments, including problems with inhibition, attention, memory, and motor functioning, Just how far does the very knowledge that the answer to any and all questions we may have at any point in time exists just a touch away extend into cognitive failures? Can the mere presence of an internet-capable device wreak cognitive havoc? For a cohesive answer to this question, we can look to a meta-analysis of 25 research articles by Perry 2024, all of which included the mere presence of a smartphone during a cognitive test to assess what scholars had identified as the brain drain effect of internet-capable technology. Typically, procedures used in these experiments required the subjects to turn off their phone's sound or vibration, or to turn the device off altogether, after which participants were instructed to leave their phone either in another room, in their bag or pocket, or screen side down on their desk, or at a desk at the front of the room with the research assistant, while they completed tests measuring working memory and fluid memory, which is one's ability to select, store, and manipulate information to achieve some goal. Subjects were then questioned about their smartphone preoccupation during the experiment, including how often they thought about the phone, as well as how, and if so, to what extent, they believed that the phone and its location influenced his or her performance on the test. There was a small, negative relationship between working memory and the mere presence of a smartphone nearby, while sustained attention, inhibition control, cognitive flexibility, and fluid memory were not related to a statistically significant level with the presence of a smartphone. As such, just being able to see a smartphone or knowing that one is within reach has deleterious influences on working memory, the processing of temporary information used for tasks such as problem solving and reasoning, but not on attention, inhibition, flexibility, nor fluid memory. One does not even need be using the internet to experience the brain-draining effects of its associated cognitive failure. Merely knowing that the device exists within one's proximity inhibits one's ability to understand and follow directions, develop an answer for a question without forgetting said question, temporarily memorize steps or instructions, and engage in mental arithmetic. You don't even need some grand conspiracy of government subdermal microchips and cell towers that use 5G to liquefy your brain to experience the mind control of modern technology. The mere presence of a smartphone emits enough stupefying rays as to cause damage to one's basic ability to reason, solve problems, and memorize things, at least temporarily. With this study in mind, what then happens when the user no longer even need recall where to access the information on a given topic, when one need not even know where the mental file is saved and immediately open it? In other words, what happens as AI becomes ubiquitous and we no longer even need to think about how and where to access information? We can just ask an AI. Although AI technology is advancing at a rapid pace, and most papers on the subject are currently speculative, we can already get some answers from Ahmed et al. 2023, who examined the relationship between attitudes towards AI, specifically the perceived importance of AI, a likely indicator that the subject used or likely would use AI in the future, and decision-making, laziness, and privacy concerns across 2 samples of Chinese and Pakistani university students. They found that positive attitudes toward AI were related to a loss of decisiveness, being unsure of themselves, perhaps delineating decision-making to AI, trusting it over their own memories or cognitions. Laziness was also related to positive attitudes towards AI, with AI proponents being more prone towards procrastination and avoiding work. The importance of AI was most pronounced in its influence on security concerns, 75%, then on laziness, 69%, nice, and to a significant but lesser degree, to decision-making. We could speculate, then, that people who view AI as an important tool tend to be more paranoid online, lazier in their self-reported behaviors, and are less decisive, perhaps expecting AI to aid them in decisions, complete tasks for them, while simultaneously also generating anxieties about being surveilled by that very same technology. It's not just internet addiction and problematic device use that produces cognitive failures then, as even the mere existence of such technology can stymie working memory. And as AI becomes more and more advanced, the proximity of information is closer than ever, allowing for even further delegation of cognitive functioning to machines, rather than storing information as memories. If merely knowing a smartphone exists damages memory, how then does the internet and its use affect learning and education? Are we facing a future wherein the AI generation will not be able to perform basic cognitive functions without constant access to technology to do the thinking for them? Or is that notion all just boomer neoluddism fighting the future? Let's find out by examining education and internet cognitive failure. For most people, school is boring, but there's never a dull moment online. At any time, any one of us can jump from whatever pressing important business we need to attend, be it answering emails, completing work projects, learning new information, etc., into an endless pit of distractions, of funny animal videos, gossip, cruise controlling for cool about politics, and of course, shitposting.
But if he's a shitposter, then I am one too, and I'll argue with you so I can get some more use.
So do all of these distractions, present at the touch of one's screens placed in front of many Gen Zs from infancy, affect how young people learn? Hong et al., 2014, hypothesized that when there are distractions and when the subject matter is not of particular interest or liking, is not enjoyable, or is not engaging, remembering that subject matter becomes increasingly more difficult, which they tested in a sample of Taiwanese 6th grade students who were given access to an iPad specifically set up for science education, and were instructed to explore any available scientific topic of their choice for 15 minutes, once a week, for 2 months. The idea behind the researchers' hypothesis was that by using the pedagogical paradigm of prediction, observation, explanation, wow, say that all 5 times fast, wherein students are given a scientific question and asked to predict an answer, then shown a demonstration of the answer to that question, and finally to explain why the results of the demonstration occurred, that students able to choose their own topic of scientific interest and asked to make predictions about that topic and later explain it will be more able to remember the information about that topic in the future. After 2 months, students were surveyed on their general learning interest and interest in learning more about the topics they explored during the experiment, as well as their experiences with internet cognitive failure, measured with questions such as, quote, "I often forget what message I posted." There was a negative relationship between internet cognitive failure and all assessed measures of interest and liking, enjoyability, and engagement, while all 3 were positively related to learning interest and intention to continue learning. Specifically, internet cognitive failure accounted for 12% of the variance in liking/interest, 22% of the variance in enjoyment, and 16% of the variance in engagement. Together, ICF, interest, enjoyment, and engagement explained a total of 67% of the variance in learning intentions. That is, decreased interest, enjoyment, and engagement with information is related to increased cognitive failure. I know, revolutionary idea that people, and specifically kids, have a harder time concentrating on something that doesn't interest them, and as such, tend to get distracted, and getting distracted online can of course lead down some, well, bizarre rabbit holes.
What words should we use? White, roots, funny. Wow.
So, in short, if you want to get some message across online, in order for people to remember that message, it needs to already interest them on top of being enjoyable and engaging. Otherwise, it will quickly be forgotten. Why do you think I put so many memes in these videos? Even if you're interested in the subject matter, if the information is presented in a particularly dry and boring format, you may be less likely to remember it. As such, what people are most interested in and find the most engaging is the content that people will also tend to remember the most. That's perhaps why, while it might seem like Twitter is nothing but politics, realistically, politics is only a subject of real interest to certain highly invested people, and even amongst them, only during certain times, around elections or major scandals. The 4 most commonly discussed topics on Twitter as of 2023, for instance, were sports, gaming, music, and food. Not politics, nor science and technology, nor finance, nor this. Entertainment is what people seek out online, and as such, internet cognitive failure likely occurs far more commonly in non-entertainment areas of interest. To better understand how internet cognitive failure may affect learning online, which was the predominant form of learning for countless students worldwide during the COVID lockdown era, Hong et al. 2016 conducted another experiment specifically examining the role that interest in the subject matter had on social media learning and internet cognitive failure. 117 Taiwanese participants were gathered via convenience sampling based on their familiarity with the YouTube channel Guitar Class of Uncle Ma, who provides tutorials for guitar and ukulele. Subjects were surveyed on their satisfaction with learning using social media, self-efficacy with learning specifically an instrument using social media, that is, a belief that one is capable of learning how to play an instrument through internet content, general interest in learning using social media, and internet cognitive failure. Self-interest in learning an instrument via social media was positively correlated with general interest in learning via social media, and both self-interest in learning an instrument and general interest were positively related to satisfaction with social media learning. In turn, internet cognitive failure was negatively related both to self-interest in learning an instrument and general interest in learning through social media outlets. Thus, given that problematic internet use and addiction predict cognitive failure, the heaviest internet users, perhaps due to their increased experience with cognitive failure, are both less interested in learning online and feel less able to learn online. All of the knowledge of the human species laid out across millions of miles of printed circuits in wafer-thin layers, and yet those who use it the most are less interested in learning and less likely to believe that they even can learn from that ever-expanding infinite web of information. Because internet cognitive failure is a product of distractions and of delegating memorization and cognitive functioning to technology, trying to answer questions without access to that technology may prove not only more difficult, but particularly stressful. Academic stress was one of several variables, including peer relationships and happiness, that was examined by Dong Sim, 2018, in relation with smartphone dependency and cognitive failure in a sample of South Korean high school students. Dong Sim found that smartphone dependency significantly affected internet cognitive failure, as well as peer relationships, and that smartphone dependency, along with internet cognitive failure, significantly affected academic stress. Finally, smartphone dependency and peer relationships in turn affected reported happiness. I would like to be more specific about the findings here, but the study is in Korean, and some of the social science jargon just does not translate in any way that I can make heads or tails of. But I still thought I'd mention the information that we can at least glean here from the English abstract and from some AI translations, which seems to be indicative that device addiction, which in and of itself we know results in cognitive failure, in addition to that cognitive failure, is potentially also related to more academic stress. While understanding the mechanisms involved in the relationship between internet cognitive failure and education, in this case academic stress, is important to help us understand the why, the what is far more readily available, as we can start to see in a study from Villa, Carballo, and Coloma Carmona, 2018, who examined academic outcomes and cognitive performance in association with problematic internet use in a sample of Spanish high school students without a history of drug or alcohol abuse, because use of such substances could negatively affect cognitive performance. Participants were queried on their social demographic variables, general internet use, problematic internet use, self-reported academic outcomes, and were given various neuropsychological tests, including tests of perceptual acuity, measured here by the ability of participants to identify the presence of certain symbols in a sequence of symbols, attention span, verbal memory, which includes immediate and delayed recall, verbal fluency, and abstract reasoning. The authors found no difference between problematic, PIU, and non-problematic internet users, NPIU, in socio-demographic variables, meaning that either is equally common across sex, age, and school year. Although the effect size was small, PIUs reported lower grades and more failed subjects than did NPIUs. Regarding cognitive ability, NPIUs had fewer perceptual acuity hits than did PIUs, while PIUs made more errors in abstract reasoning than did NPIUs. That is, students who do not experience disordered internet use are less likely to fall into faulty reasoning than those who do, but they tend to be more accurate when identifying patterns, which the authors hypothesize may be due to greater familiarity with essentially staring at screens and identifying patterns.
Computers don't make errors. What they do on purpose.
Two regression analyses, which allow statisticians to determine how much of the variance in an outcome variable, in this case academic achievement, is affected by other variables, in this case problematic smartphone use. In their first model, for NPIUs, perceptual acuity was positively related to average school grade and negatively related to failing a class, as was error in abstract thinking similarly negatively related to failing marks in a specific subject. In their first model, for problematic internet users, only error in abstract thinking was correlated, negatively, with a failing grade in a course. In a revised second model, they found that problematic internet use, errors in abstract thinking, and perception were all significant predictors of average grades, with PIU explaining the largest portion of the variance in total GPA. Both acuity and abstract thinking, but not PIU directly, collectively accounted for 3% of variance in failed classes, which while small, was statistically significant. In total then, students who struggle with problematic internet use tend to get poorer grades and are more likely to fail a class than are those without disordered online activity. Outside specifically of academic achievement and looking just at cognitive ability, adolescents with PIU tend to make more cognitive errors than those without it, but are better able to identify patterns, perhaps as a product of greater familiarity with technology. The key takeaway, however, is pretty simple. Adolescents who experience problematic internet use tend to underperform academically and struggle with reasoning.
Your grades have been steadily declining. You're late for class. You look like you had a plastic surgery.
Bro, I've been on a mewing streak.
Mewing is not a major at this university.
As previously mentioned, the ways in which different generations use the internet tends to vary. While millennials and Gen Zs are nearly identical in terms of all but 2 to 3% not owning a smartphone, Gen Z seems to be the generation most dependent on smartphones, according to Pew data. A 2023 Pew report found that 46% of Gen Z teens said that they use their phone almost constantly, compared to a decade earlier when the median age of the iPad generation was just 10.5, and as such, only about a third fell within the 13 to 17-year-old cutoff for this particular survey. Almost constant use was reported by 23% of adolescents, just over half of what it would be 10 years later. Further, fewer and fewer Gen Zs have even bothered with paying for internet access at home, with 28% of younger millennials and Zoomers reporting to Pew in 2021 that they relied exclusively on cellular data for internet access, while less than 15% of all other age groups had moved to using mobile data only. The point is, Gen Z, the generation raised online, tends to rely more on smartphones than other devices for internet access, and as such, we should examine how smartphones affect learning, as many Zoomers are still high school and college aged, which we can begin to do by looking at a study from Bozmale and Jalouk 2017, who surveyed Lebanese students on their cumulative GPA, class rank and department, their smartphone use, including age at first time of use, duration of use on a weekday, and reasons for use, their lifestyle habits, including smoking, drinking, and frequency of religious practice, which, being conducted at a Catholic university, was predominantly Christian, as well as various socio-demographic variables. A lower GPA was associated with being older, being male, being a sophomore, drinking and smoking, but of interest more to us today is that having a lower GPA was also related to having begun using a smartphone at an earlier age, as well as with using said devices for non-academic purposes. In their fourth and full regression model, smartphone addiction, smoking, drinking alcohol, using a smartphone for study purposes, faculty, and class were related to GPA and collectively accounted for between 15.2 and 21.5% of the variance in grades. Smartphone use itself was not related to lower GPA, but the age of first smartphone use was negatively related to academic performance, with an odds ratio of 1.2. Meaning that a 1-year decrease in the age at which a child was introduced to such a device equated to a 20% increase in the likelihood that same child would receive a GPA under 3.0 in college, compared to drinking alcohol, which was related to twice the likelihood a student would receive under a 3.0 cumulative. So, drinking is about twice as bad for GPA as early smartphone use. But one of those things is the recreational consumption of poison. So, that's rather damning for the smartphones. They also found that students who use their smartphones for study purposes were 69%, nice, less likely to have a GPA above a 3.0. Using a smartphone, therefore, is unlikely to be a problem for academic success in and of itself. But for students who have grown up with every answer to every question just a few clicks away, and who utilize these devices for academic purposes, those technologies may be deleterious to educational outcomes. Of course, GPA is not a determinant of academic success, merely a predictor of it, albeit a rather good one. But there are many factors that can influence school performance, including motivation and personal perception of one's abilities. To better understand the effect of smartphone use on students' perceptions of their own academic success, Buktok, Kim, and Kim, 2021, surveyed over 3,000 junior high and high school students in the Philippines on their smartphone addictions and smartphone use behaviors, including time spent upon waking up until first smartphone use, frequency and duration of smartphone use during the weekdays and weekends, years of smartphone experience, type of internet access, purpose of use, and days spent without a smartphone. Nomophobia, again a fear of not having access to one's phone, perceived academic performance, ranked as low, medium, or high, and demographic details regarding both themselves and their families. Somewhat harrowingly, less than 1%, 0.5%, of students reported no symptoms of nomophobia. 15.9% had mild nomophobia, 60.9% had moderate, and 22.7% had severe nomophobia. Further, 62.4% presented with some symptoms of smartphone addiction. 40% checked their phones within 5 minutes of waking up. Another 37% checked them within the first 30 minutes after waking up. And the plurality of students, 35%, spent more than 10 hours a day on his or her phone, while 12% spent less than 4 hours with screens in an average day. The three most commonly listed uses for smartphones were accessing social networking sites, then chatting, and then playing games. The mean age of students in the study was 14, and the mean years of smartphone experience was 4.9, once again illustrating just how ubiquitous smartphone use is, particularly for Gen Zs and Alpha. When asked how many days they thought they could survive without their phones, the majority of students, 60%, reported being able to live sans device for 3 days or less. Concerning grades, a similar 60% of the sample believed that their academic performance was about average. They found that frequency of smartphone use on weekdays, purpose of the use, nomophobia, survival days without a smartphone, and smartphone addiction were all related to lower perceived academic performance, meaning that students who use their phones a lot are afraid that they can't live without access to the phone and have symptoms of smartphone dependency, also believe that they are not performing well in school, which can result in self-fulfilling prophecies. For a broader look at the educational effects of smartphones, let's turn to Paterna et al. 2024, who conducted a meta-analysis of 29 research articles specifically on problematic smartphone use and academic success. They found a significant but small relationship between problematic smartphone use and academic achievement that was consistent across the sexes, age groups, and geographical regions. The strength of the relationship between problematic smartphone use and academic achievement was similar in strength in its negative effect on the latter, as was openness to experience, healthy behaviors such as playing sports, health indicators such as sleep quality, positive experiences with learning outcomes, and perceived support from teachers positively affected learning. While again the effect was small, it was consistent and significant. Students who are addicted to their internet-connected devices believe they are less academically adept. But are they less academically adept? For answers to that question, we can look to a longitudinal analysis from Amez et al. 2023, conducted over the course of 3 years at 2 Belgian universities. Students were surveyed once each year regarding their frequency of smartphone use for 9 different uses, such as taking pictures or listening to music, how frequently they use their smartphone during class and while studying, smartphone generation and access to the internet, academic motivation, general health, relationship status, average exam score across all courses, and a variety of socioeconomic factors previously found to be predictors of academic performance, including relevant changes in those variables over time, such as changing one's major, parental divorce, or death of a parent, the kind of thing that might cause one to change majors from photography to vigilantism and start associating with Canadians. They found that after controlling for all other variables in the full model, a 1 standard deviation increase in overall smartphone use resulted in a decrease in the average exam score by 0.349 points on a scale from 1 to 20. Similarly, a 1 standard deviation increase in smartphone use during class or while studying produced a decreased average exam score of 0.375, about 2%. A 1 standard deviation increase in overall smartphone use forwarded an increased failure rate of 2.6% on exams, with smartphone use specifically during class or study sessions forwarding a 1.7% increased chance of failing a test. As such, we've seen correlationally, psychologically, and longitudinally, excessive smartphone use and access to all of human knowledge appears to cause more harm than good concerning academic outcomes for students. If problematic internet use negatively affects learning, what about specific internet-connected devices, such as ones that can be easily used during class and study time? And what about that specific use of the internet, which, while amongst the most popular, is certainly one of the least intellectually stimulating? Social media. So does social media and its presence on our phones affect educational outcomes? We can begin with earlier research from Junko and Cotton. Wow, I was not expecting a Danganronpa and King of the Hill crossover here.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought this was the bathroom. Oh, good lord!
Who examined the effects of multitasking with internet communication technology and educational outcomes in a sample of US undergraduate students who were surveyed on how much time they spent using their phones for various activities, including searching for information online, using Facebook, email, IM, and making calls in general, as well as how many calls they had made yesterday specifically, how many texts sent on average and yesterday, how often they multitasked using internet communication technologies while preparing for class, and how familiar they were with a set of internet-related skills, which actually included things such as proficiency with using search engines, but feel free to get creative with it.
Screen time is an internet kid taken to its sort of logical conclusion. As a youth, he was exposed to his grandfather's experimental internet gas, and that has patched him permanently into the World Wide Web.
Now let's all agree to never be creative again.
Finally, each student's high school and college grades were provided to the researchers for the analysis. The most common form of multitasking while doing schoolwork that was performed frequently by these students was texting, reported by 51% of the sample, using Facebook 33% and emailing 21%. However, the amount of time spent on Facebook far exceeded all other activities, with an average of an hour spent on Facebook while also studying or in class per day, compared to just 7 minutes spent messaging others online. But that doesn't mean these subjects weren't talking. As well ostensibly working on academic activities, they sent an average of 98 text messages per day. While internet skills were positively related to GPA, Facebook use and texting were both negatively related to school grades, with emailing, searching for information, calls, and instant messaging being unrelated to GPA. Thus, we can see, pretty early on, social media was acting as a distraction that hindered academic performance. As you might expect with internet use broadly and smartphone use more specifically then, social media seems to have its own unique negative impacts on learning outcomes. But let's quickly go through a few individual studies, such as this one from Toulouse et al. 2018, who examined social media use and academic performance in Saudi Arabian university students. The plurality, 38.3%, reported that social media use had a negative effect on their academic performance. Despite acknowledging that social media was negatively affecting their schoolwork, 77% of subjects strongly or somewhat agreed that social media was a positive thing in their lives. Overall, while 20% of all students' time was estimated to be spent on social media, only a few felt it affected their free time, and only 10% believed that they had symptoms of addiction. An earlier study from Kopinski et al. 2013 examined multitasking, social network site, SNS use, and GPA in a sample of Europeans and Americans enrolled in an undergraduate or graduate-level college program. Participants completed a survey that included self-reported GPA, hours spent per day on social media, multitasking use of SNS while studying, and demographic variables. they found a moderately strong negative relationship between hours a day spent using SNS outlets and GPA, as well as a smaller but still negative relationship between SNS multitasking and GPA. Time spent using SNS was negatively related to GPA in both the US and European samples, but SNS multitasking was only negatively related to GPA in the American sample. Those who used SNS while studying tended to have higher GPAs than those who spent less time studying overall, indicating that while SNS multitasking may stymie learning, it's still better to multitask and study than to not study at all. Despite this, less than 3% of subjects in both samples reported being good at multitasking. In the European sample only, students who did not multitask actually had lower GPAs regardless of their own social networking site use, again indicating that multitasking is not necessarily a bad thing for learning, but it seems that across the board, greater social network site use can lead to lower grades in school, at least potentially. A report from Lau 2017 surveyed undergraduate college students in Hong Kong on their frequency of social media use for both academic and non-academic purposes, belief in their ability to multitask while completing schoolwork, and cumulative GPA. Social media multitasking and playing video games both predicted lower GPA scores, while watching videos, sharing content, and using social media for academic purposes were unrelated to GPA. Once again then, here we see that social media seems to serve as a hindrance for learning with no seeming benefits of any type of social media use for academics. Guinciglia et al. 2020 tasked Italian university students with keeping daily diaries, keeping track of how frequently and how much time they spent using social media over the course of a week, and compared differences in this behavior with their GPAs and past exams. Students checked social media more and spent more time on it while studying than while in class. Although instant messages were the most commonly checked form of social media, little time was spent on them, with social networking sites taking up the greatest duration of time, a little over 3 hours a day while studying or in class. The duration and average number of times students checked their social media while studying was negatively related to academic performance in terms of both exams and GPA, but the most harmful variable for educational outcomes was duration of time spent using instant messaging apps, with longer lapses in use being related to better performance. Further, and rather predictably, these effects were more pronounced in science majors than in humanities majors. But for both, frequency of checking social media and duration of use were consistently negatively related to academic success. For a broader view, we can turn to Dolik and Lajoie 2018, who conducted a meta-analysis of 23 research papers on the subject of social media use and academic performance. Across these studies, a negative relationship between social network site use and educational outcomes was present in 61% of the findings, with 35% finding no relationship and only 4% finding a positive relationship between social media and success in school. While there may occasionally be a positive use for social media in learning, most of the time, using social media is uniquely deleterious to one's education in ways that other internet use is not. While older generations, specifically Gen X and Millennials, had access to online technology during their formal education, particularly higher education, once again, Gen Zs and Alphas are the first to have had access to such technology from early childhood, if not just birth outright. As such, we should consider how screens, digital devices, the internet, and social media influence childhood development. Any new media technology inevitably comes hand in hand with fear of its unknown elements. How does it work? What does it do? And how does it affect people? Since long before the advent of the World Wide Web, parents, activists, and professionals alike have been concerned with the effects of media on child psychology, going back as far as Bandura's infamous Bobo doll experiment. And for obvious reasons. Of course, we want to ensure that children are not inadvertently harmed by new technologies. A review of literature on the effect of screens on cognitive development from Anderson and Subrayanam 2017 illustrates that for children under 2, screen time is negatively related to language and executive functioning. likely due to the content being made for older children or for adults, and thus largely background noise for an infant. However, that background noise tends to be disruptive to play and to parental interaction, including the quantity and quality of parental language used with toddlers between the ages of 1 and 2 years, indicating the very presence of screen distractions can negatively affect parent-child communication from an early age.
Well, you winning, son?
By about 2.5 years old, coherent children's programming becomes more comprehensible, and viewing educational programs becomes associated with greater school readiness and increased academic performance from preschool through high school. After that, the results are all over the place, though. There is some evidence that screens distract from other cognitive activities such as reading a book and may reduce attention spans, but the findings are inconsistent. If there is a danger posed by new media screen technology to the development of children, it's likely most pronounced when children are too young to even comprehend what it is that they're looking at or interacting with. In other words, in infants and toddlers. A meta-analysis of specifically internet use on child cognitive development from Mills 2016 draws from 15 published articles of subjects aged 9 and up, all of whom were still in school, and consistently found that internet use was related to memory deficits, and heavier users were less likely to use analytical reasoning when previously given access to the answers to a series of questions, simulating the lack of access to search engines, and generally were less able to successfully multitask. Finally, an explanation as to why Twitter is such a shithole. A more recent meta-analysis from Clemente Suarez et al. 2024 of 157 studies published since 2001 concerning digital device usage on childhood cognitive development provides us with more insight. They found that while exposure to such devices produces dopamine, subsequently inhibiting attention, the cognitive demands that the near-infinite nature of the internet provides may also be linked to production of brain-derived neurotropic factor, a protein that aids in neuron growth and plasticity, which is the ability to respond to different situations and stimuli, making thinking more rigid and likely explaining in part the need to rush to a phone for answers. Regarding physiological development, multitasking demands children split their attention, making focusing more difficult and may hinder the development of executive functions, including problem-solving, memory, and cognitive flexibility. This effect was dualistic, in that educational content aids in these functions, while entertainment content inhibits them. For example, children who use tablets specifically to read ebooks tend to have better developed literacy skills, and educational games have been found to help improve memory in children. Similarly, while educational games and content may improve attention spans, problem-solving, and memory, access to digital technology outside of the educational arena can do the exact opposite. Further, screen time in young children not directed by parents or involving pro-social content has consistently been associated with delays in social development.
How do I look, yellow man?
You look like you're about to tell your friend not to come to school tomorrow, man.
Finally, given that it may induce dependence on digital devices, early exposure in childhood can subsequently result in children experiencing anxiety, depression, feelings of anguish, tension, and anger, particularly when deprived of such devices. Although whether these relationships are wholly correlational or causal is not yet definitive. While more research on the effects of screen time on childhood cognitive, social, and emotional development need be conducted, the early results are worrisome to say the least. But it doesn't stop there, as screen time in the very young may actually alter the brain itself, as we can see in a study of brain white matter integrity and screen exposure from Hutton et al. 2020. The integrity of white matter tissue is crucial for cognitive functioning, and as such, anything that might damage that integrity could significantly affect the intellectual development of children. 47 preschoolers and kindergartners aged 3 to 5 with no history of neurodevelopmental disorders were given a series of tests to assess language skills and emergent literacy before their brains were scanned via fMRI. Their parents were also asked to answer a questionnaire assessing the child's behavior and use of screened devices. The median age for screen access was 18 months, with an hour and a half of median daily use. 60% of this sample of children had their own portable device, and 41% had a television or portable device in their bedroom. Higher screen use was related negatively to performance on tests of phonological processing, vocabulary, and emergent literacy, although this relationship failed to reach statistical significance when household income was included in the predictive model. Screen use was also correlated with lower fractional anisotropy, FA, and higher radial diffusivity, RD, two biomarkers of white matter integrity, with high RD and low FA being associated with white matter atrophy. The regions of the brain most affected by this effect were those involved with language, visual processing, and executive functioning. This remains significant when controlling for household income, indicating that while excessive screen use may not present with immediate delays in child development compared to other factors, namely parental wealth, that exposure causes damage to white matter integrity and, as such, may damage a child's language, executive functions, and emergent literacy skills long-term. If screen use in children could very much cause later problems in cognitive development, and given that problematic smartphone use, social media addiction, and internet addiction in general are related in and of themselves with impaired cognitive functioning and memory, then what chance do those who have grown up reliant on screens from infancy stand to regain some of that capacity that they possess, yet cannot fully access due to a lifetime of outsourcing brain power to cell towers?
From the moment I understood the weakness of my flesh, it disgusted me.
Unfortunately, the problem may not be so simple to ameliorate, as seen in an experiment from Van Wezel, Absorption, and Van den Abele 2021. Participants in this study were invited to the lab where they performed two sustained attention tasks: a self-report of ability to sustain attention, assessments of personality and mood, and followed by a third sustained attention task. Subjects provided the researchers with their smartphone use data from the past 7 days to establish a baseline, and an app was installed to limit the usage of Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and YouTube compared to that baseline, either by 50% in the experimental group or by 10% in the control group, which, while typically no treatment would be administered to the control, the researchers chose to include this minor reduction to avoid the Hawthorne effect. The Hawthorne effect is a tendency for people to change their behaviors when they are aware that they are being observed by researchers. Thus, a small reduction in allowed for screen time was included even in the control. 7 days later, subjects returned to the lab and repeated the same tests as before. Somewhat unfortunately, this attempt to adjust for the Hawthorne effect seems to have failed, as both groups significantly decreased in their screen time during the week following the initial assessment, although there were still differences between usage of Instagram and total social media screen time. Participants in both groups reported that they reduced their habitual phone use, but only those restricted by 50% reported a reduction in problematic smartphone use, indicating that they felt the reduction had improved some symptoms of cognitive failures affiliated with such use. Despite similarly reporting experiencing fewer cognitive lapses, those with restricted access to their smartphone did not perform better on subsequent tests of attention. While obviously more work need be conducted here, these initial findings are disconcerting. Although I would imagine it's certainly possible to overcome an addiction to smart devices, as with any addiction, it seems like it probably takes more than a simple week of cutting back on usage to see any improvements in cognitive failure and attention span. Not everything about access to internet technology and cognitive ability is equally disconcerting, however. As while the excess of information may overload younger people, it may also aid older adults in maintaining their cognitive abilities, as we can see in a study from Meyer, Mell, and Gliski 2017. Following a small pilot study, samples of older U.S. adult residents of 2 retirement communities who either did not have social media accounts or who accessed them less than once a month, but did have access to the internet and were not suffering from any neurological, psychiatric, or medical conditions, were recruited to join a class either about using Facebook, using the diary website Penzu, or were offered a place on a wait list for either class, with the latter two serving as control groups. Participants in the Facebook class condition attended 3 2-hour-long sessions over the course of a week, accompanied by homework assignments designed to teach them how to use the website, and were assigned a new profile that was only connected to other participants. After the week-long course, subjects were tasked with logging in twice a day and updating their status for 7 weeks. Those assigned to the Penzu group took a similar course and were similarly instructed to make a diary entry every day for 7 weeks. Verbal memory, speed of processing, reaction time, visual scanning and processing, executive functioning, including updating, which is a refreshing of working memory, shifting between tasks and inhibition from irrelevant habitual reactions in favor of relevant but less habitual ones, the successfulness of the social media training program, and cognitive functioning were all subsequently assessed. Compared to the waitlist control group, both those trained in using the online diary and Facebook performed better at cognitive task updating, with the Facebook group experiencing the biggest improvements. In contrast, only the control group experienced improvements in shifting between tasks. And although the Facebook training also seemed to improve shifting, and the online diary group experienced larger shifting scores, neither were statistically significant. Speed of processing improved in those who had completed the Facebook training and worsened in the control and diary groups. In total, then, it seems that for older adults, social networks may actually help the brain stay active, increasing mental processing speed and updating behaviors more expediently. A similar study from Quinn 2018 invited residents of an independent living facility who were over the age of 65 to a 2-hour-long workshop once a week for 4 weeks to learn about how to sign up for Facebook and Twitter, privacy and online security, social media etiquette, as well as the various uses of social media for messaging, photo sharing, status updates, and information gathering. Measures of cognitive functioning, executive functioning, inhibition control, visual scanning and tracking, and working memory were administered before and after taking the class. She found that those older adults who took the social media course presented with minor improvements in processing speed while taking the class, and moderate increases in overall cognitive functioning after the class had concluded. Inhibitory functioning also improved both during and after the course. Participants who took the social media workshop expressed increased speed of processing, yet it did not reach statistical significance, and there was no difference between the experimental and control groups on working memory. Once again then, for older adults, social media may actually aid in some elements of cognitive functioning, albeit only minorly and only in certain arenas. But these findings at least provide something of a silver lining to the societal storm cloud that is social media and increasing reliance on new technologies to replace everything from cognition to socialization. Thus, this silver lining does really seem to be just that. Little more than a glimmer of hope at the eye of the storm. So with everything we've learned about how the internet, social media, and smartphones are potentially actually making us stupid, let's come to a few conclusions. Throughout history, new technologies and inventions have often been met with skepticism and even outright fear as to what unforeseen effects such advancements may have on society. Since the birth of mass media, perhaps no other singular type of technology has been more subject to scrutiny for serving specifically as a social influence. Whether it be radio programs supposedly striking public panic over fears of a fictional alien invasion, to hysteria about comic books convincing children they can fly or deflect bullets like Superman, to television and film and video games causing violence. The media has been blamed for any number of ills over the years, and yet little quantitative data has ever supported the contention that mass media can directly influence human behaviors, what's known as the hypodermic needle theory, and is largely considered to be debunked. However, smart devices present a very different type of media exposure compared to radio, television, video games, etc., in that access to the media is constant and often bidirectional. Our connection to the rest of the world and all of the information ever cataloged by the human species is unremitting online. As more and more services move exclusively online, with more of daily life requiring access to the internet, from paying bills to getting a job in the first place, and with things like digital ID looming on the near horizon, the ability for people to even function in society without the internet grows increasingly more difficult. But even if we could, it appears taking breaks to touch grass does little to mitigate the effects of perpetual internet access. And those effects? Well, it's everything from delayed development, difficulty learning, problems with memory and absent-mindedness, difficulties with problem-solving and critical thinking, coordination issues and clumsiness, shorter attention spans, decreased educational performance, and even changes in brain gray and white matter volume and integrity. And given the younger and younger ages at which children start using smart devices, the true extent of these effects cannot yet be fully known. If, however, the evidence is anything to go by, and I see no reason why it should not be at this point, then the brain drain caused by the internet may only become more visible over time as children raised more by iPads than by parents enter adulthood, bringing with them their generational addiction to smartphones and all of the cognitive deficits and failures that comes with it. Then again, humans are excellent at adaptation, and perhaps the worst is already over, as it does seem that millennials are more negatively affected by internet addiction than our Zoomers. But hey, what do you guys think? Do you find yourself getting easily distracted by things online to the point that it negatively affects your work? Have you ever found yourself reaching for your phone for an answer to a question, even if you think you know what the answer is? Have you ever outsourced some of your brain power to new technologies such as AI? Does the brain drain of the internet pose a serious threat to society? Or are all of these findings just technological growing pains? Let me know what you think in the comments down below, not only because I genuinely am curious, particularly because I found myself deferring to Google searches rather than relying on my own memory plenty of times, and I didn't really notice it until I started writing this video, but also because comments really help the video in the algorithm so that it gets shown to more people. If you liked the video, be sure to leave it a like and subscribe if you're not already subscribed. And if you really liked what you saw, you can consider supporting my work on Patreon or Subscribestar, linked below to see your name at the end of every video along with these fine folks here. If you don't want to go off-site and leave YouTube, you can also support me by becoming a channel member for access to special emojis in the comments section and Premiere Chat. If you'd like something more tangible for your support, you can check out my merch store with social science-themed apparel and goodies. Finally, if you want to hear more from me, you can find me on the Broken Crown channel, where I do a weekly news and politics podcast with my co-host Spoon, and play a weekly Pathfinder game, if you're interested in something a bit more nerdy. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, dear friends, Alt-Volt.
Click, tap, forget, repeat. Click, tap, forget, repeat. Click, tap, forget, repeat. Click, tap, forget, retreat. Click, tap, forget, repeat. Memory fading, dopamine beat. Click, tap, forget, retreat. Read my mind and press delete. Fading fast, neon dream. Too much noise to hear a scream. Brain